All right, so we're gonna review some concepts from the reproductive system today, and that's probably gonna be our last online WebEx streaming session. So a few things, step by step. First of all, the pathway for the sperm to flow, you should know that. So it is generated into the seminiferous tubules, then through the straight tubules goes into the reti testes, then goes to the epididymis. From in epididymis, sperm matures, and then it enters vas deferens or ductus deferens, and from vas deferens, ejaculatory duct, and then goes into the urethra. So it takes quite a while for the sperm to get to the urethra. Maturation happens, production happens mostly in the seminiferous tubules. Maturation happens in the epididymis. Main glands that contribute to the sperm generation, sperm production. Well, glands, I mean the semen generation. It's going to be seminal gland, which produces seminal fluid. Prostate gland, it's a sperm activation, and bulbourethral gland, lubrication of glans penis. Now there are some components that I want you to be aware of, components of a sperm. First, fructose and other carbohydrates serve as a source of energy for sperm cells, spermatozoa. Clotting factors allow sperm to clot in vagina to prevent it leaking out. Prostacyclins contribute to the vaginal contractions, so the sperm can be propelled towards the uterus and eventually towards the fallopian tubes. And there are some enzymes that will after some time liquefy the sperm clot to allow spermatozoa to move further into the female reproductive system. Mechanisms of ejaculation. Well, not ejaculation, but male sexual response. So you have to understand there are two systems contributing to it. It's sympathetic and parasympathetic. So parasympathetic response, it starts with the release of NO from endothelium, then vasodilation of the blood vessels in corpora cavernosa and corpus spongiosum of the penis, which leads to increased blood flow, which leads to erection. Now, sympathetic responses responsible for ejaculation, contraction of smooth muscles that surround ejaculatory duct, propulsion of sperm. Okay, so we got this out. I'm just checking what I need to talk about. Oh, okay, yes. So, hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis in males. I'm gonna say a few words about it. I'm just checking. Okay, so yes. Okay, so we've got hypothalamus, which produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland, which produces two gonadotropins. So FSH acts on testes, producing androgen binding protein. And then LH acts on, and FSH acts on specifically not just testes, it's going to be Sertoli cells in testes. So Sertoli cells, LH acts on Leydig or interstitial cells, which produce testosterone. Now testosterone binds to ABP, and after that binding, you have sperm maturation. Now simultaneously, so first of all, testosterone has inhibitory function on both hypothalamus and anterior pituitary, and testes will also release a hormone called inhibin. So this is a negative feedback loop established by inhibin and testosterone, and actually increasing numbers of sperm will depress the increase the amount of inhibin and depress the axis. So basically, it's essentially a self-regulated system, which normal for hormones. So in regards to the roles of these cells, so we have Leydig cells that chiefly responsible for testosterone generation. They are located in between the seminiferous tubules. So this is a tubule, that's another, and that's another. This is where you can find Leydig cells. Sertoli cells will be inside of the tubule. So the function of Sertoli cells is to guide the maturation and development of sperm. And I'm not going to get into very much details of meiosis, but I want to highlight this. So we start with Spermatagonia, and Spermatagonia, they divide first, so they go through mitosis, generating a daughter, generating a daughter cell. Just wanted to make sure that I know. Daughter cell will go into the meiosis 1, and the result of meiosis 1, let me make sure, yes. So result of meiosis 1 is that we've got two secondary spermatocytes here and here. And if we have 2N, so this is a diploid cell with a double chromosomal set, so 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. Here we have single set, so no pairs, 23 chromosomes, 23 chromosomes. And then each of this, via meiosis 2, will produce, in the end, you're going to get 4 spermatozoa. And this 4 spermatozoa, meiosis 2 is like a regular division, basically. So meiosis 2 is the final step before mature, kind of mature spermatozoa are generated. So one spermatogonia which is diploid, will result in the production of 4 spermatozoa, which are haploid. I'm not going to talk too much about the structure of testosterone. and functions of testosterone, I want to highlight one particular thing about testosterone. Supplementation, exogenous supplementation of testosterone by, for instance, bodybuilders. If you think about the whole hypothalamus pituitary gonadal axis, exogenous testosterone will inevitably inhibit production of gonadotropin releasing hormone and gonadotropins. The absence or decreased levels of gonadotropins due to inhibition from exogenous testosterone will lead to the lower stimulation of testes and eventually to degradation of testicular tissue. They will essentially shrink. Now, let's say a few words about the female reproductive system. So again, I want to highlight a few things. So first of all, we have vagina, we have uterus, and we have ovaries. So ovaries are connected to uterus via fallopian tubes, but ovaries and fallopian tubes are not physically connected. Okay, so ovaries, that's ovary, that's a fallopian tube. There is a space. So after the ovulation, the secondary oocyte may end up in the peritoneal cavity. It's totally fine. It will disappear. Second thing, layers of uterine wall. We have perimetrium, which is around surrounding connective tissue. We have myometrium, which is muscle, smooth muscle. And we have endometrium, which is the mucosal layer inside of the uterus, and it is shed. Endometrium consists of two layers, stratum basalis and stratum functionalis. Stratum functionalis is shed during menses, and stratum basalis allows the regrowth of stratum functionalis. And we'll get to the regrowth when we get to the menses. Now, what I wanted to, again, address briefly, if we look at the development of female gametes, female sex cells, here's what you're gonna see. So we've got oogonium, okay, and oogonia are formed embryonically in embryo, okay, and then let me make sure again that I'm not. So oogonia divide mitotically, producing a bunch of primary oocytes. So that's going to be a primary oocyte. During childhood, it enters meiosis 1, not completing it, okay? So those primary oocytes are at the start of meiosis 1, they still diploid. And then every month after the onset of puberty, polar body is produced, and let me make sure, and secondary oocyte. So secondary, that's the completion of meiosis 1 and start of meiosis 2. Again, meiosis 1 is completed. Okay, meiosis 2 starts. Meiosis 2 is not completed yet. Secondary oocyte is ovulated. When secondary oocyte is ovulated, if it is not fertilized, that's it. If it is fertilized, then it produces another polar body and ovum. So fertilization is required to finish meiosis 2. So again, Meiosis 1 occurs before puberty. So basically, primary oocytes, they enter meiosis 1, not completely. It's completed on a monthly basis. And so primary oocyte completes meiosis 1, enters meiosis 2, and in an anaphase, gets stuck in an anaphase, forming secondary oocyte. And only secondary oocyte is fertilized, it develops into the egg, into the ovum. So what's ovulated is secondary oocyte, not an ovum. You see that from one primary oocyte, only one secondary oocyte is produced, and it happens once a month. If you compare it to millions of spermatozoa that are generated by the male organism every day, basically, and this is one every month, you see, well, and it has proper physiological explanation because chances of spermatozoa to reach secondary oocyte are quite slim, so you need millions of them in each ejaculation. And also, a woman has to bear a child. So, having multiple oocytes being produced in the same month increases the chances for carrying twins or triplets or whatever. And that lays as a burden, biological burden. Like, just from survival standpoint, it's harder to tend to multiple kids than for one because, humans are very developed animals. Anyway, so in terms of the progression of the follicles, so follicles from primordial to primary to secondary to late secondary to antral follicle. They correspond to the stages of development of the oocytes. I don't mind that much that you know all of that. But antral follicle is the one that gets ovulated. And what's left after the antral follicle ruptures is so-called corpus luteum, or yellow body. It has important endocrine function that we will discuss in a few minutes. But I want you to basically understand this. So let's talk about the ovarian cycle in females, and it's quite complicated. I will try to picture it. It's not super easy. We'll start with hypothalamus, which produces gonadotropin releasing hormone, which acts on the anterior pituitary gland, which produces FSH, which acts on the ovaries, and LH, that also acts on the ovaries. And the result of LH stimulation is production of estrogen, and that's follicle growth. So follicle keeps growing while estrogen inhibits production of LH. Okay, so negative feedback. But follicle becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and produces more and more and more estrogen. And at some critical point, the negative feedback between estrogen and LH changes into a positive feedback stimulation. So estrogen rises, LH starts to surge. Estrogen rises, LH starts to surge. This is the ovulation. So when follicle is ovulated, the feedback shifts back, changes back. That's estrogen and progesterone, quite frankly. So it shifts back. So rising levels of estrogen and progesterone, which are contributed by corpus luteum, shut down LH and FH, and shut down gonadotropin releasing hormone. Okay, so they rise. However, at some point, corpus luteum will start to, if there is no fertilization, corpus luteum will start to degrade. Levels of estrogen and progesterone will start to decrease. This inhibition will go away and the cycle starts over again. So it can be depicted in the form of a graph. And we will try to put, and those are not up to scale, okay? We will try to put these pictures together on the same graph. It's going to be a bit challenging, but I think we can do it. So estrogen, sorry, LH. So you can give them. So that's luteinizing hormone. And FSH stay pretty low. Estrogen also stays relatively low. And progesterone is no. Progesterone is completely in the gutters. Okay. So that's going to be progesterone, and that will be estrogen. At some point when LH and estrogen establish this positive feedback loop, here's what you see. You see an increase in estrogen and a spike in LH. And you see a bit of a spike with FSH. FSH that keeps declining because now this one keeps declining. And this decline is because although levels of estrogen initially decline, they go back because here it's the corpus luteum that produces estrogen, and at the same time progesterone starts to rise. Okay, so here's what you see. This is the follicular phase, follicle maturation. Negative feedback part, positive feedback part, negative feedback part again. This is ovulation. This is the luteal stage of the ovarian cycle. That's when corpus luteum takes over production of estrogen and progesterone, not the follicle. Now, what about the menstrual cycle? So with the menstrual cycle, you've got this stratum functionalis, okay, that has been shed during menses, and the way it's been shedding is quite magnificent. So blood vessels that supply blood to stratum functionalis, they contract, basically suffocating, inducing ischemia. That ischemia leads to the death of stratum functionalis. Then these blood vessels dilate, and the blood flow washes those dead cells out. Okay, so menses correspond, if we will try to put this graph, well, I shouldn't have moved it, only for estrogen and progesterone. So if this is your progesterone, and this is your estrogen, okay, estrogen and progesterone. So this is menses. Estrogen is the proliferative phase, okay? So during proliferative phase, that's when endometrium grows. That's when stratum basales keeps generating, keeps growing stratum functionalis. It just keeps it growing, okay? So menses, proliferative phase, and then when progesterone starts to rise, that's the secretory phase. So it's a rich secretion that prepares endometrium for the implantation of fertilized ovum. It ensures that there is a mucus plug at the uterine cervix, so no sperm can reach in there because its fertilization has been done already. And then if there's no fertilization, progesterone and estrogen are going to tank. here menses will occur and the whole cycle will start over. Now, what I wanted to say, a few more things about the whole fertilization process and stuff like that. First, don't even need to draw. When you have sperm cell entering secondary oocyte releases calcium. Well, first of all, sperm cell has acrosomal enzymes that diffuse corona radiata around secondary oocyte. Like they destroy the wall, and sperm cell can enter secondary oocyte. Once sperm cell enters the secondary oocyte, the release of calcium leads to the refractory changes in the membrane. So fertilized secondary oocyte cannot be entered by a second sperm cell. It's impossible. Okay. DNA of sperm cell and secondary oocyte fuse. Secondary oocyte completes. Well, first it completes meiosis II, then DNA fuse, and you have diploid as a result of that fusion, result of fertilization of a diploid zygote, basically diploid fertilized ovum. Fertilization usually happens in the fallopian tube. If secondary oocyte fertilized ovum gets stuck in the fallopian tube or gets stuck outside of the fallopian tube, let's say in the peritoneal cavity, this is going to be considered an ectopic pregnancy, which is a life-threatening condition. Normally, it will migrate all the way through the fallopian tube into the uterus, and it will implant itself into the uterine wall, into endometrial wall, and special cells in the endometrium called trophoblasts. They will basically destroy part of the endometrium in order to provide a perfect implantation site, and they will be responsible for feeding the developing embryo, developing blastocyst and then embryo for the first few weeks until placenta develops. And I want to say a few words about placenta. So basically what happens in placenta, it's the exchange, gas exchange. So you've got maternal arteries, okay, that develop oxygen, that deliver oxygen-rich blood. And you have umbilical arteries that, yes, they go away from the heart as our arteries do, but umbilical artery that branches into multiple little sinuses, okay, that's umbilical. Well, it's okay. Let's do it slightly different way. So you have this the sinuses, and sinuses are fed by umbilical arteries, okay? And there's a gas exchange. So oxygen from maternal arteries, maternal blood, goes into the deoxygenated blood of a fetus in the sinuses. That's what happens in the placenta. And then umbilical veins carry the blood back to the heart of the fetus. And, maternal, what's they called? Uterine veins, for example, yeah. Yeah, uterine veins will carry the blood back through the systemic circuit of the mother back to the heart. So there is an interesting effect called double Bohr effect between the mother and the fetus. So here's what happens. So if we will say that this is maternal blood, this is fetal blood. So here's the direction. CO2 goes from fetal to maternal. That increases the CO2 concentration and lowers the pH in maternal blood, which increases unloading of oxygen. And lower partial pressure of CO2 in the fetal blood will improve loading of oxygen on the hemoglobin in the fetal blood. So this is why it's double Bohr effect. So one Bohr effect increases the unloading of oxygen in the maternal blood, and another Bohr effect increases loading of oxygen in the fetal blood. Okay. We got this. Hormones. I want you to know 3: human chorionic gonadotropin. It's a gonadotropin that's produced during the first trimester of pregnancy, and then progesterone and estrogen, they take over, and so estrogen is necessary for increase of the uterus in size, and progesterone is necessary for maintaining proper structure of endometrium so fetus is comfortable growing. Now, a few things about the birth process I wanted to mention. We discussed it before, not even going to draw it. So, a little decrease in progesterone levels allows some contractions, uterine contractions to occur. So that will stimulate mechanoreceptors in the uterine cervix, which will send the signal to the posterior pituitary, which will release oxytocin. Oxytocin will stimulate contractions directly, uterine contractions. Also will stimulate the release of prostacyclins that lead to contractions. Stronger contractions increase pressure on the uterine cervix, which increases the release of oxytocin from posterior pituitary, which increases pressure on the uterine cervix, and it's just positive feedback loop, which results in birth. Now, breastfeeding. So mammary glands are altered sweat glands, produce milk. Milks grow from the glandular tissue through the sinuses and ducts, and leave the breast through the nipple. Breast tissue is mostly connective tissue, mostly fat. Glandular tissue, obviously, the one that produces milk. 2 hormones that regulate breastfeeding. So one, and I want to make very clear, so the stimulus for both is suckling of a nipple. In one case, it will stimulate hypothalamus to produce prolactin releasing factor, which stimulate anterior pituitary to release prolactin, which acts on the breast glandular tissue to produce milk. And another posterior pituitary gland release of oxytocin let down. Oxytocin, sorry, I misspelled, grossly misspelled. Oxytocin will stimulate the smooth muscle that surrounds the lactiferous ducts to release the milk through the nipple. So you see, you need suckling, and look at this. As long as suckling continues, it stimulates milk production, and it's a long term. And suckling stimulates oxytocin to start let down. Now, when baby stops sucking on the breast, prolactin levels stay pretty high, and milk gets produced, it's just not out because no oxytocin is produced. When baby starts to suckle on the breast, oxytocin is produced, squeezes those ductals, you have release of milk. That'll be it for reproductive.